I'm going to be talking tonight about Rahab and the idea of overcoming fears, facing our fears. And the MCC person I want to talk about tonight is Reverend Steve Peters. This is not the best picture of Steve. There are worse. But Steve is an amazing gentleman. I have a little bit of Nancy's book I'll read to you about him. Does anybody know who Steve Peters is? You ever met him, heard him, seen him? When I think about AIDS and MCC, it's impossible not to talk about Reverend Steve Peters. Steve came into MCC in the early 70s with Ken Martin, pastor of Good Shepherd in Chicago, went to McCormick Seminary and had a family connection and pastored in Hartford, Connecticut before moving to Los Angeles. A bright and rising star in MCC with a great singing voice and a really good preacher. He was also one of the first in MCC to be diagnosed with AIDS in 1984. By that time, he had been ill for 2 years, when they were still calling it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. Steve was devastated. He had AIDS in a time when that was a death sentence. It was right before Easter. His friend Lucia Chappelle and others gathered around and watched an I Love Lucy marathon. Thus came an early lesson: laughter and friends are key to beating something as lethal as AIDS. That becomes such an important principle over the years in MCC and worship and our serious or dramatic moments. Laughter was healing. Steve got sick fast. Reverend Ken Martin offered up his pulpit and asked Steve to preach himself into resurrection that Sunday. Steve preached God is greater than AIDS. Now remember, this is 1984, which became an MCC rallying cry. In 1985, Steve was chosen to participate in one of the first trials of an AIDS drug called Suramin, which had been used to cure African sleeping sickness. Steve had always been starstruck and was what we affectionately called a musical comedy queen. His very gay response to being attached to an IV pole for hours at a time at the hospital was to sing his way through it, musical after another after another. One nurse wrote on his chart, only side effect of drug, singing like Ethel Merman. Steve was the only person who survived that trial. The drugs blew out his adrenal glands but did not kill him. This brought years of medical ups and downs for Steve, during which he became a prominent and one of the first poster boys for the disease. The very first Hollywood AIDS benefit was held in September 1984 for the AIDS Project Los Angeles, called Commitment to Life. Steve was asked to be the first person with AIDS who would speak at the first glittery Hollywood event. The event was chaired by the glamorous Elizabeth Taylor, who Steve would come to know well over the years. That night she gave the first Commitment to Life award to First Lady Betty Ford. The same night, an emotional Burt Lancaster read a moving letter from Rock Hudson, who at that moment lay dying of AIDS. In the green room, Steve sat with Phil Donahue, Marlo Thomas, Shirley MacLaine, Carol Burnett, Stevie Wonder, Linda Evans, and Cher. Steve was in heaven, never mind AIDS. This was something he'd only fantasized about all his life. Before they went on, Steve and the celebrities were thrust into a press room with all kinds of paparazzi. When it came to the TV media, no one asked Steve a question until Rona Barrett risked it and asked him how he felt about being the poster child for the disease. Out of the 1,000 attendees, at least 200 were well-renowned movie stars and celebrities. The rest, they hoped, were people connected to the industry. Shirley MacLaine introduced Steve and just said, "Just speak the truth, Reverend," and he did. He told them he was living with AIDS, not dying, and that he could still dance, at which he tap danced. He told them that all who were ill or soon to be ill needed their help and needed it now. Steve went on to appear on Tammy Faye and Jim Baker's program as a gay pastor who had AIDS. I remember seeing that and thinking, wow. He is still living, and he is thriving and doing well, and is experiencing some of the problems that come along with getting old at a time when he thought he wouldn't see the next 2 or 3 weeks. Steve's a good friend, and I just love him to pieces. And I told him in a text message that I would be talking about him soon. So I don't know how many of you have dealt with AIDS, have dealt with people who have AIDS, have been around in that. It's really important to remember that, especially now, it's not a death sentence. It's not a death sentence. Okay, facing our fears with Rahab. kind of interesting story. It's one of those stories I remember hearing about when I was a kid, and it gave me so many questions. Can you imagine what kind of questions would you think maybe came up about the story of Rahab? Anything that you read that made you kind of go, huh? Why is that in the Bible? What was her profession? A prostitute. Now, some more moderate conservative Christians try to make it out she was an innkeeper. But the word that's used is specifically harlot, which is not an innkeeper. It's interesting, another thing I always had trouble with, they said her house was built on the wall. Now I imagine a wall, and here's a house. I couldn't understand how that could come to be. But at that time, Jericho was surrounded by two walls, 13 feet in from another. And they would lay wood across these two walls and build houses on those because they were running out of area on the ground. So her house was one of the ones that was built on the wall. Did you ever hear that or catch that? Wonder how they could do that? Also, another thing that's kind of interesting about Rahab is that she was an independent woman. It said her house. She had family elsewhere she had to go gather, but she owned her own house. 15 feet apart, excuse me. We'll talk about this in some of the questions, but that was one of the places that people could go, men could go, and nobody would question, who are you and where are you from? Because lots of people came through her house, evidently. Prosperous lady. But what I'd never caught quite in the story, I didn't realize that they were under siege. They realized the Israelites were coming to get them. And so every night they would close the gates so no one could get in the city. So the spies had come in during the day, but then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, the gate's closed. And that's kind of where the red cord comes in. Okay, just kind of giving you a little bit of background there. Let's look at the questions that we have tonight. First of all, somebody read Hebrews 11, 30 to 31.
I'll read it.
Okay.
By faith the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had received the spies in peace.
Okay. By faith, it says. Kind of been the theme of this whole study, by faith. In the Message Bible, it says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And then if you go over to Joshua, I don't know if you had time to read this or not, but it's a really cool story. I don't know quite where I began to have my love for Hebrew scriptures, but some of them are just really great stories. If you ever have children that say, oh, the Bible's just for sissies or whatever, take them to some of these stories. Let's look at the first question. We'll read some of that chapter 2 as we go on. What character traits of Rahab emerge from this encounter in Joshua 2? What kind of character traits? What do you find out about this woman? We've said she was a prostitute, okay. But God chooses and uses very unusual people sometimes. What do you find out about her? I think you find out she was pretty gutsy, you know. She was willing to take that risk. She also had looked around and saw what had been happening in the land as the Israelites kept moving through. Jericho was not their first place they conquered, not the first one. Word had traveled. When that horde of Hebrews start coming, you better be careful because they're going to take you over. So she was pretty nervy, gutsy, especially when you think about her encounter with the police, the government people that came. It's really cool because she goes, you know, they went that way when they had gone that way. A little bit of nerve there. I think we also see that she's a little bit trustworthy because after the guys got out, she could have said, they're going that direction even though I told you here. She could have gone back and changed it. She made some really important choices during that time. The unbelieving Israelite generation that left Egypt had all died in the wilderness. Now the new generation was ready to enter the land God had promised long before to Abraham, which is why Joshua, Israel's new leader, sent the 2 spies into the land. Why do you think the 2 spies were sent into a prostitute's house? Kind of talked about that already. It was an inexpensive and anonymous lodging. They probably didn't go to the king's house and say, can we stay here and check out and see what's going on? They were there casing the joint. They were there figuring out where the strongholds were. You know, it's interesting, if you read the chapter just before the Jericho story, something I'd never noticed before either. Notice how it said everybody had died out that came from Egypt? Joshua had received word from the Lord that all the men now needed to be circumcised. So I don't think they would have been in a mood to put up with a whole lot of hassle from anybody. So it was inexpensive, it was anonymous, they could kind of sneak in and out, nobody would ask questions. Isn't it interesting how the same way people look at that now as they did then? Is anybody awake? Rahab's lie, Rahab's first work of faith was a lie. Was Rahab right or wrong to lie about the presence of the spies? Let's look at chapter 2, verses 4 through 6. The woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, yes, 2 men did come to me, but I don't know where they'd come from. At dark, when the gate was about to be shut, the men left. But I have no idea where they went. Hurry up, chase them. You can still catch them. She had actually taken them up on the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax that were spread out for her on her roof. Have you noticed a pattern with these people that are called people of faith? Have you noticed that many times there's a lie involved? There's a deception involved? Sometimes you just don't see that in Sunday school. They don't make that connection. I think that's just been really interesting in this study. But the question is, her first work of faith was a lie. Was she right or wrong to lie about the presence of the spies? Who wants to defend the fact that she was right to do it?
I think it was a necessary.
Pardon?
Lying isn't necessarily right, but I think that lie was necessary.
Why?
Because they were a spy from the Hebrew army, some of God's people. It ended up saving her life.
Yeah. It was imperative that the Hebrew line continue. That's the prime directive all the way through the Old Testament, that the Hebrew line continue. And so it was maybe a timely lie. How could it have been a problem for her to lie? Real dilemma. The lie was actually wrong. She could have lied and trust God to work it out. You know, if God can make a donkey talk later on, God can make these things get to happen in the right way. But the higher moral issue was the protection of God's representatives. What was at risk for her for lying? Her life. Her life would have been at risk if they'd figured out she lied. Can you imagine if, we were talking about critters being in the attic and stuff, can you imagine if one of those guys had sneezed while the officials were outside the door? You know, it's interesting because even though she was a prostitute, there was still this whole Eastern thought of you don't rush into a woman's house. They didn't go in and search, they stood at the door and asked her. But can you imagine if one of those had sneezed right as she was telling her lie? That could have cost her life. Also, it took a step of faith for her to trust that they were going to follow through on their side. So there was a lot of at risk. She could have saved them and still been killed when all this happens later. Sometimes we get in those dilemmas, don't we? Of what's the lesser of two evils? think too often in our lives, sometimes we take the easy way, which may not always be the best choice. What did Rahab want from the spies in exchange for concealing them on the roof? Somebody want to read 2:12-13?
Sure. Now then, since I have dealt kindly with you, swear to me by the Lord that you in turn will deal kindly with my family. Give me a sign of good faith, that you will spare my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death.
See, they already knew what happened when the Hebrews came into a parcel of land. Pretty much so everybody that was there that was opposed to them died. And she's asking for a promise that she and her family will be safe. And the word she uses there is hesed. That's a loving kindness, a loyal love that's based on keeping a covenant, keeping a promise. I think that she probably knew enough about the Hebrew people to know how important covenants and promises were. She was seeking protection for her family, and she wanted a reward. You know, she wasn't just doing this out of the kindness of her heart. I've saved your hide, now won't you save mine? She saved them, and now they should save her. Did this isn't any questions, but did the spies have a choice? Could they have just said, thank you very much, and gotten out? They could have. They could have. But you know, when she used that Hebrew word hesed, that's one of those, golly gee, she really knows what we're talking about. Golly gee, this is serious. This wasn't a pinky swear, you know? This was something seriously she was asking them about. If Rahab was simply bargaining for her safety, why does the writer see Rahab's willingness to welcome and hide the slaves as an act of extraordinary faith? She was just bargaining for herself. How would that be? I mean, she was doing it for her good. It's going to be positive for her and her family. What's involved in faith with that?
If she'd been caught really bad.
Okay, she'd been caught really bad. And faith that those guys were going to do what they promised. Because she knew they weren't just there, two guys wandering around the wilderness, wondering for themselves. They were there as part of this movement of the people of God. So basically, she was having faith that they would be faithful to their God and faithful to their promise. Her faith, she of course had some self-centered motives, but the writer of Hebrews saw this as an act of faith, convinced of God that the spies would win. It reminds me if you picked the wrong football team. She must have truly believed that when the Hebrews came into that area, they were going to be victorious. Compromise or selfish faith may be counted by God as an act of trust. Acting on faith doesn't always mean you put yourself in a pitiful position. Sometimes acting by faith ends up being much to your favor. It can be very positive. Sometimes in ways you don't even realize that it's going to work that way. I know people who have stepped out on faith and trusted God in their finances. That doesn't mean they start giving 95% of their salary. That'll be okay. You know, but they step out on that and they kind of have some queasy. But we've heard people testify in the offering that, you know, that doing that, they've been able to step forth. And sometimes that step of faith is a itty-bitty baby step. You know, a lot of times, especially when we start talking about money, we think, oh no, they're going to want me to double what I give. You know, but if God lays it on your heart, not somebody guilt-tripping you from up here, because if you've been in my ministry very long, you know I don't preach a lot about money. That's between you and God. But if you step out just that little bit, it'll be amazing as you step out that little bit and God takes care of you. Then you can take another little step, and another little step, and another little step. So whether or not she realized she was taking a gigantic faith step or not, in retrospect, the writer of Hebrews says, wow, that was a big step. She truly could have just been trying to save her hide, like I said. Sometimes it's only in retrospect we can see where we trusted God. We may think we just kind of got through, but it was actually trusting God. And we may take steps that are trusting God that we think at the time are totally crazy. But in retrospect, you can see how it worked for your good and for God's good. What acts of faith were required of Rahab after the spies left? Okay, so she's told them she wants them to save her. They leave. Does she have any more faith steps to take? What did they tell her to do so they would know it was her house?
I had country cord outside of
Put a red cord at her window. Now, some people think that's where the term red light district came from. Okay, we won't pick on anybody wearing red tonight. My father just forbid my mother to wear red. It's so funny. So she took that step of faith. She put the rope out. She didn't just think, okay, I made a promise and God's going to have to figure it out. She made that step. She put that rope out. What else?
She gathered everybody together.
She gathered her family in. Okay, now picture this. They're in this city. They know that this horde of Israelites are coming. And wherever they come, they conquer. And she goes and says, come on, Mom and Dad, you're going to be safe. Come to my house. Now, the question is, did they want to go to her house knowing what it was? And then she says, oh, no, these Hebrew spies, they promised me. I don't know about your mom and dad, but my mother and dad would go, huh? You know? And she gathered them all up so they would be ready. Sometimes we scuff our foot and twiddle our thumbs and overthink what God's asking us to do. And honey, she put the rope out. She gathered the family. One more thing. She kept their secret. Any time in this story, she could have gone to the authorities and said, they've spied on us and they're coming. Not that they could have done a whole lot about it probably, but she could have done that. She could have said they'd been there. Again, this is a woman taking steps of faith, trusting people she'd never met before, trusting people that she didn't really know a whole lot about, except how awful they'd been to everybody else coming through. But there was some connection there between them and her that she trusted. Explain what Rahab's obedience reveals about her relationship to the Lord God. Now, I'll stop there a minute. Rahab was not Jewish, right? She wasn't a Hebrew. How did she know about the Lord God? How did she know about God? That God. Sure, she had her other gods. How did she know about the Lord God?
I guess when she was telling them she heard all these stories about how they were making it through here, that she must have thought they had something on their side.
Mm-hmm. They may have even been bragging in the right way about, this is what God has told us to do and this is what we're doing. She may have heard it from people who had come from those other cities who came to visit her in Jericho. They may have told her about this Lord God. These are just things I had never thought about a whole lot before. But she takes these big, trusting steps in a God that she has no word to read about, in a God where she's never really met anybody except these two guys who were followers of Jehovah. But somehow there was a massive connection. Massive connection. So this shows that her faith was genuine. Shows that her faith was genuine. She evidently really believed that God was going to give Jericho to these folks. Because she put out the cord, she gathered up her folks, she didn't tell anybody else about it. And that she trusted God to extend grace to her, a Gentile, a non-believer. The Hebrew tribe group was a pretty non-inclusive group. They were there, and there were people that were going with them, were their sisters and brothers and cousins and aunts and uncles. And they didn't allow a lot of people from the outside to come in. But somehow she realized that God was going to show her grace. She trusted God to extend grace to her, even a prostitute. Look at Joshua 6:25 for just a minute. But Joshua let Rahab the harlot live. Bless her heart, every time her name comes up, they have to put that in, okay? But Joshua let Rahab the harlot live, Rahab and her father's household and everyone connected to her. She is still alive and well in Israel because she hid the agents whom Joshua had sent out to spy on Jericho. She and her family were the only inhabitants of Jericho left alive after the conquering. I want to look at just a minute about this process of how they conquered, because I think it's a great story and doesn't always get covered in this lesson we had tonight. We're going to be looking at Joshua chapter 6. I want you to listen for some key things in this. Jericho was shut up tight as a drum because of the people of Israel. No one going in, no one coming out. Remember, Rahab told them, our whole town is quivering. Our whole town is scared. So they already knew there was a little bit of advantage there. God spoke to Joshua, look sharp now. I've already given Jericho to you. Hear that? I've already given Jericho to you. So why didn't Joshua and the folks just walk on by? God knew it was going to happen. They needed to put the feet to it. Here's what you're to do. March around the city, all your soldiers. Circle the city once. It would take, what they guesstimated, the size of Jericho, the size of the group, about 30 minutes. Just a little stroll around. Repeat this for 6 days. Circle the city once, repeat for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horn trumpets in front of the chest. What's the chest? The Ark of the Covenant. If you don't know anything else, Indiana Jones. It had the 10 Commandments in it and other things there. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times. Now you're talking about 5 hours, more or less, of walking. Now, every time they walked around the city, you've seen enough of these kind of movies, probably the people of Jericho were standing up there looking over. They were armed with bows and arrows. I wonder why they didn't just start shooting at them then. They got used to it once a day, 6 days. But now the 7th, they do it, and they do it, and they keep doing it. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing away on the trumpets. And then a long blast on the ram's horn. When you hear that, all the people are to shout at the top of their lungs. I get scared just reading that. Can you imagine if we're sitting here in church and there's a group that comes, let's say every Sunday, and walks around the building once, blowing horns, making noise. And the next Sunday, and for 6 Sundays they do that. And the 7th time, 7th day, they march around 7 times with all this horn noise. And then at a certain point, they all start yelling. I'd be scared. I'd be scared. The city wall will collapse at once. All the people are to enter, every man straight on in. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priest and told them. Okay, let's look at another faith step. God's told Joshua to do this. And now he has to tell the people who are going to actually be marching. Can you imagine what they thought? Take up the chest of the covenant. 7 priests are to carry 7 ram's horn trumpets leading God's chest. They told the people, set out, march around the city, have the armed guard march before the chest of God. And it happened. It happened. Now, I'm sure there were some people who said, he's lost his ever-loving mind. Okay? But regardless of the skepticism, it happened. 7 priests with their 7 ram's horns set out before God. They blew the trumpets, leading God's chest of the covenant. The armed guard marched ahead of the trumpet-blowing priests. The rear guard was marching after the chest, marching and blowing the trumpets. Joshua had given orders to the people, don't shout. In fact, don't even speak. Now that's even scarier. Got a bunch of people just walking around your town, and they're not talking. They're not saying anything. Not so much as a whisper until you hear me say, shout, then shout. He sent the chest of God on its way around the city. It circled once, came back to camp, and stayed. For the night, Joshua was up early the next morning, and the priest took up the chest again. 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, etc., 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 doing the same thing again on the second day. They marched around and went back to camp. This is crazy warfare, isn't it? They run out, they go back. They run out, they go back. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. One person said they thought that by that time the army of Jericho probably had gotten used to them doing this. It kind of gotten lax. Wasn't really being as intense. Except that day they circled 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua gave the people the command, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that in it are to be devoted to God. Only Rahab the prostitute, bless her heart, and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you'll not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you'll make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble in it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord, and we must go into his treasury. The Hebrew nation was made up of human beings. And when this city collapsed and all the stuff that was there, I think it might have been a little tempting. I'm thinking it'd been tempting just for clothes. They've been walking around the desert for 40 years. You know? I would have been tempted. You know, she might say, look at that neat bowl. Wouldn't that go well with our stuff? Josh said, don't be tempted. Don't be tempted. Or else you'll bring destruction on us. But the fancy stuff, the silver and gold, the things that we can trade later, if need be, or use in the building of the temple, we're going to take that with us. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong with her in accordance with your oath to her. So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, the father and mother, blah, 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 blah. Then they burned the whole city, everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. As we said before, so Joshua spared Rahab. I hear a lot of faith throughout this story, not just Rahab. I hear a lot of faith. Faith in one another. Faith in God who said you're going to have this city. But everybody in this story had to face fears. What did Rahab have to be afraid of? Her life. People figuring out what she'd done.
Maybe they wouldn't honor the promise.
Fear that the spies wouldn't honor their promise. Because she was pretty clear, we know you're going to take us over. What did Joshua have to fear? That God would be true to God's word. God had led him to it. You ever heard that? If God leads you to it, God will lead you through it. He may have had a little bit of fear that God was going to really do this. Because you know, now he's the new leader. Moses has died. He's taken over. What did the spies have to fear?
She would turn them in. Maybe that she would turn them in.
She would turn them in, and when they came by, they would see them. Fear that maybe Joshua wouldn't keep their promise because they had made a solemn, hesed promise. And you know, sometimes those over us don't always keep up their end when we make a promise. They always follow through on that. And the people of Jericho, what did they have to fear? Exactly what happened to them, destruction. Now, we're not going to get into how come that was okay for the children of Israel to go through and kill all those people. I'm not going to get into that. So my question now is, what are you afraid of? What are you afeared of? They'd say out in the country. You don't have to say out loud, you just might want to think about it. Because I think most of us, you know, I like to joke that I'm not afraid of anything. I'm not afraid of snakes. I'm not afraid of spiders. I don't want to entertain them in my back pocket. But, you know, I'm not afraid. I can't think of anything like that I'm afraid of. I faced fears of dying. I faced fears of, you know, somebody coming into a church or an office and causing problems. But those are kind of just logical fears. Fears are right in front of you. Anybody have a fear they'd want to share? There's no boo hiss on this. I know for a long time my mother was afraid of dying. And that kind of confused me because, you know, she was a really good Christian lady. She was so afraid of dying that the first time she and Daddy made out a will, it tripped her out so much she was in a psych hospital for 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
I told my sister to go get the will, make a photostat, make a copy, burn it in front of her, and we'll know the will's still in there when we need it. But she got past that, thank goodness. Anybody afraid of anything that they want to share?
Yes, I'm afraid of dying.
Afraid of
I
dying?
haven't got a picture yet, but I will.
Mm-hmm. And that's a, you know, that's a legitimate fear that a lot of quote-unquote good Christian people have. And I don't think it's so much the fear of dying as just the fear of what's going to happen. Not even the fear of heaven or hell, that type of thing. Just what's that process like?
What is the people that's left here going to get along without you?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yep. Yep. And that's, you know, that's a legitimate fear.
I'm more afraid of my kids, something happening to my kids than I am.
Mm-hmm. Fear of those we love, our children, our friends, our family, something happening to them. Yeah. And you know, that's one of those fears where you can't really do anything about it except encourage them to be safe and all that good stuff. So all you can do is pray God's protection around them and your peace and comfort in that. I can't imagine how afraid Steve must have been in 1984 when he got that diagnosis. He'd already been sick for 2 years and didn't know what was going on. And I had a lot of friends in the mid-'80s that they would get a diagnosis, and within 6 weeks they were dead. He went into this protocol with 12 other men, and all of them died except him. I would have been really afraid of him. Oh my gosh, what's really going to happen now? You know? I will say that one of the things that came out of that and MCC working with the fear of AIDS, one of the things that came out was a verse that became very important. Perfect love cast out all fear. Perfect love. It's in 1 John somewhere. Perfect love cast out all fear. Doesn't say destroys the fear. It says casts it out, overcomes it, gets us through it. The last question on here is, the next to last, Rahab's story reminds us that no one, not even our enemy, as Rahab initially thought was the Israelites, is beyond God's reach. What group or individuals have you written off as unreachable? You know, I'm sure we don't understand always, but the Hebrew people looked differently. Now, I'm not trying to be, you know, anti-Semitic, I don't mean that. But they were not dressed like the people where they went into these places. They may have been out in the wilderness so long, their coloring may have been different. So these two really different men show up. And she may have figured, you know, there's nothing they can do for me. Who have we written off in our life? You don't have to answer that. You may not want to. We won't get too political. But we have to be careful because a lot of times people have written off LGBT folks. People have written off allies and family and friends of LGBT folks. Women have been written off many times through history. Nothing no good's going to ever come of that. Different parties write off different people. Negative people. And yet Rahab was willing to work with them for the good, for the ultimate good. Which of these faith stories we've talked about a lot of different people the last few weeks. Has any one of those struck you or stayed in your mind? Moses, Joshua, Esau, Jacob, Rahab. I hope you'll think about them because, yes, they were characters way back yonder in the Old Testament, but every one of them set an example for somehow we can have faith. We can have faith. Faith is not blind per se, but faith is something that we can depend on. As we started out, faith is the evidence of things not seen. The evidence of things not seen. Kind of, if you can really see it, is it faith? It may be faith that it's not going to blow up. It's not going to change. But taking those steps, and again, let me say, little bitty steps. Because even in walking, if you start taking big, long steps, you're going to trip over something. Or I am. I'm going to step in a hole. I'm going to hit a water puddle, something. But as we take those little steps, it's time for us as a church to take some faith steps. It's time for us as individuals to take some faith steps. Now, next Tuesday we will not meet because Wednesday is the Thanksgiving Eve service. I hope you'll be able to be present with us on that. And the next Tuesday, we'll be starting the Advent groups, and that will be 6:30 to 7, and then at 7 we'll have Bible study. So if you want to be, the Advent group will be over there in the chapel, and then we'll come in here for Bible study, or we'll join y'all who are in here for Bible study.
What time will you meet next Wednesday?
7 o'clock. Yeah. I wish we could do things at 6, but it's so hard for everybody to get here. So it's usually 7 o'clock is unless like these Advent groups will be 6:30. Any last minute prayer requests or praise? I kind of have a praise that the election went positive in lots of ways. That there are a lot of new leaders in the Senate and the House of Representatives. And prayers for those poor people in those states where they're still counting. Still counting. I can't imagine having to go back, even in Roanoke, and having to go back and recount every vote. And one of the states, maybe Georgia, their machines are older and they have to recount each election. Governor, Senate, House of Representatives, all the way down to dog catcher or whatever the lowest one would be.
When you watch it on TV and they're taking those ballots in Florida out of the boxes and put them in whatever they're doing, they're stacking them neatly, or how do you keep them from getting mixed up again? Yeah, there's no way of telling what ballot you've already put through those machines.
Amen.
Would you pray with me? Loving God, I thank you for this group of folks who so faithfully come out to study how faith can affect our lives. I thank you that we can be honest about our fears. We can be honest about the things that are challenging to us. And that we have a level of trust with one another. Indeed, do watch over our country. Watch over those who are working on the election still. Watch over those who are going to Congress. Watch over those who lead our states. And watch over those who are going to end up leading our denomination. Continue to let us trust you in the big things, but also in the little bitty ones. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.